everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related material to take you away from whatever's happening in your everyday life. What I do here is I attempt to answer a question by a viewer, reader, or listener. You can send it to me via an email, via commenting on a previous podcast or YouTube video. You can, of course, listen to the big podcast, which is once a month, or even the Ancient History podcast. You can find those simply by searching Ancient Warfare Podcast or Ancient History Podcast, and they'll come up. The other thing, of course, is you can back us on Patreon, one of three different levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. And, of course, one of the most important ways that you can ask me a question is you can send me a postcard, another postcard. Now, this one, for those of you who are not from Australia, is from Tasmania. That is a Tasmanian devil, not the one that we see in the cartoons. So that is a Tassie devil. And this one came from Damien. Thank you, Damien. Hi, Murray. I love the magazine and the podcast. Thank you. Or podcasts, plural. Excellent. Thank you. My question is there any evidence for a standardized padded garment worn under armour in non-Roman armies, the equivalent of a subarmalis, or might it be assumed to be an individual choice? Ooh, interesting. The subarmalis is an interesting one in terms of a garment worn under Roman armour to stop wear and friction, which there's very little evidence of, but there is evidence of, if that makes sense. There's depictions in archaeology which have been interpreted as that. There are some backings on armour plates which may be that, or they may just be the backing of the armour. And of course, when we move away from Roman armies, we do have evidence of some, certainly tunics worn under armour. Is there other elements? Probably there's certainly a felt lining worn under helmets and things like that to make sure that the fit is right. And, you know, there's some archaeological depictions of what looks like padded armour. There's a really interesting shift that the padding, according to what we know, is for the wearer, not the effectiveness of the armour. It's to stop the wearer chafing and rubbing rather than that. Now, some people who've reconstructed their own bronze armour and things like that have made the fit tight and don't require padding, but probably, and you know, there's pictures of zooming in on greaves, for instance, and showing that there's something underneath the greave to be a barrier between the skin and the bronze greave, so that, you know, to stop it from cutting or chafing and things like that. But perhaps the best evidence of a non-Roman subarmalis does in fact come from a Roman source. This is the translation of De Rebus Bellicus by an anonymous author in the 4th century AD, and chapter 15 talks about the thoracomachus. Now, thorax, thoraco is what we get, and linothorax obviously is about linen thorax, blah, blah, blah. So thorax machus, so it's a padding for the thorax. Now, that's a Greek term, which is perhaps an indicator that it's a longer lasting item. Now, interestingly, it's felt, and I'll read you the De Rebus Bellicus passage here, and the translation is by E.A. Thompson. Among all the inventions devised for military purposes by the ancients in their forethought for future generations, we have the thoracomachus, a wonderfully useful article for relieving physical discomfort, which they invented to counter the weight and friction of armour. For this kind of garment, which is made to measure from felt to protect the human body, was worked out of soft wool by the ingenuity that comes of anxious fear, so that when it had been donned first, a cuirass or mail suit or the like would not injure the sensitive body through the friction caused by its weight. The limbs of the wearer, too, will be adequate for their work when aided by this comfort amid the vicissitudes of war and weather. Now, interestingly, what the De Rebus Bellicus tells us is that this was devised by the ancients. Now, that's not particularly specific in terms of when was it devised, but it is useful in the sense that it's obviously got an antiquity. Now, a 4th century AD Roman author can refer to the Roman Republic as the ancients, even the early years of the Roman Empire as the ancients. They can, of course, also be referring to the ancient Greeks and Hellenistic kingdoms as the ancients. So this is useful to tell us that it's earlier than the 4th century AD, but not particularly useful to tell us that it's necessarily non-Roman. Going back to archaeology, however, we do find that there are felt finds in I'm going to mispronounce it, aren't I? Pazyk finds, which are 5th century BC, Pazyk, which are Scythian or Scythian finds in the Barrows, 5th century, 4th century BC. Now, interestingly, those ones are decorated, and with the sort of the subarmalis, you don't have decorations on them. They're a much more practical sort of idea. But as are some early tunics, and then, of course, by the late Roman Empire, tunics themselves are also decorated. And you get this sort of sense, and there are examples of Roman armies being surprised before the men can don their armour. Can they don this presumably easier to put on undergarment? In which case, it may well be that they are decorated, and so these finds from these Scythian tombs are useful. And there's some other evidence. There's leather coverings, felt coverings. There's an edict of Diocletian on the felt coverings for shields and things like that. So it's probably much more common than the archaeology tells us, simply because it's an organic material and it doesn't survive in many contexts. I'm not sure if there's some evidence which is interpreted as being this in the Dura Europus finds or some of the ones from Jerusalem, but I think most of the other finds from Northern Europe are not friendly to organic matter. So you've got this sort of felt lining, as I said, used in helmets, it's used in some shoes. Slippers are made of felt, but there are caps and there are socks, undones or udones. Now, interestingly, we can sort of look at the next part of the chapter. In the case of the weight of the thoracomagus itself should be increased when it is sodden with rain and should thereby hamper the wearer. It will certainly be advisable to wear it on top of a similar garment made of well-prepared Lydian fleeces to the cut of the thoracomagus. So there's layers being talked about. Of course, if your felting is good, if any of you have worn a felt cloak or something similar in modern weather, they are very weatherproof. Of course, if you are in constant rain, such as if you were invading Scotland, for instance, Scotland, you are going to eventually get that wet. But of course, one of the other things about this, as anyone who hikes knows, if you're wearing wet wool next to the skin, it's still effective at keeping you warm. Whereas if you're wearing more modern materials like cotton next to the skin, you'll basically start to get hypothermia and you'll give up body heat, whereas wet wool will still work, which isn't mentioned in this, and it's not sort of a mention, but if you're fighting battles in the rain, of which there are several examples, if you've got wool next to the skin or felt next to the skin, you're actually going to be much more effective in battle than people who are not wearing wool next to the skin. Anyway, where was I? So as we have said, the soldier has donned this thoracomagus, which has adopted this name from the Greek because it protects the body, and has put on his socci too, that is his boots, and iron greaves, with a helmet on his head and a shield and a sword fitted to his side, and has caught up his lances in his hand. He will be fully armed to enter an infantry battle. So again, this is fascinating. Now, the De Rebus Bellicus is an interesting document because it examines not only military reforms, but it also examines fiscal corruption, which it's trying to correct in the late 4th century. And some of the military reforms are very peculiar. He recommends the adoption of scythe chariots and other very strange-looking weapons. And I haven't got a good copy here, but I'll try and show it to you. Sorry for those of you listening on the podcast. It is plate 9, which actually shows the thoracomagus. You can probably find it if you do an internet search on either De Rebus Bellicus or thoracomagus, which is that garment there. And it's a plate to accompany, a medieval plate to accompany the treatise. Now, in all likelihood, the medieval plates were copies and versions of original plates which accompanied the text. So like the Notitia Dignitatum and others, we've got clues as to what the original looked like, even though the ones surviving are much later themselves. But I would tend to think that that technology of felting and things has been around for a lot longer than the Roman Empire. And so therefore what you've got is an ancient technology which was probably used by Greeks for a long time and worn under armour as a protection to the wearer to stop their armour from chafing. There is enough, I think, in the archaeology to suggest that it's not just tunics. And I think that the interesting idea is that, yeah, the wearing of the breastplate or the armour, any armour, without that is something that some reenactors do, but it's probable that there's these other garments. And it's interesting that the Thoracomachus is fitted. It's made for you, so it's not just a here they all are. So that's an interesting aspect as well. Anyway, I hope, Damien. Oh no, what have I done with your postcard? I've got to put it somewhere special. Oh, here it is. I hope, Damien, that answers your question. I'm going to put you on the postcard shelf next to Cato. So there he goes, Tassie Devil. Look at my lovely collection of and there's another one up here, which is just off camera, of postcards. Send me a postcard, PO Box 222 Belfield, NSW 2191, Australia. That will get to me. And join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.